my copy. Horror Films for Children, Fear and Pleasure in American Cinema by Kat Lester. And what we're going to do tonight, in order to kind of mark the publication of this book, we're going to discuss the book, discuss its kind of contribution to the study of horror films and the kind of interesting relationships, fascinating relationships, in fact, between horror and children, with the author of the book, and also a distinguished panel of people who are here to sort of celebrate the book and also to talk about all things relating to horror and children. So first of all, I just want to introduce and welcome the author of this book, Kat Lester. Kat is a lecturer in film and television at the University of Birmingham, and as well as being the author of this fantastic book, she's also got a forthcoming edited book on Watership Down. Kat, has that book got a title as yet? Would you like to give it a plug?
It does. Yeah, I recently submitted the manuscript, and I know I can see some of the contributors here, which is really nice to see. And it's called Watership Down, Perspectives on and Beyond Animated Violence.
Brilliant. And do you know when it's going to be out?
I don't, because as far as I know, it's sort of in peer review at the moment. So we'll see what happens when that comes back.
Watch this space, basically, and I'm sure we'll be promoting it via the SIG as well. And you know, broadly, your research focuses, all of your research really focuses on that kind of intersection between children's culture and the horror genre, doesn't it? I know you've also got a lot of interest in animation as well, and all aspects of children's cinema, but with a particular focus on horror. So I just want to start by once again congratulating you on publication of the book. Give it another promotion with its wonderful cover there, which we'll be talking about in a moment. Before we bring the panel into the discussion, I just wanted to ask you a bit about the genesis of the book, really, and the kind of journey that you've gone on in terms of thinking about children's horror. So, you know, when you started this project, what were your key motivations for doing it in the first place, for conducting this research on what can broadly be termed the category of the children's horror film?
Well, thinking about the origins of my interest in children's horror, it really goes back to my undergrad days, which we're talking like a decade ago now, which feels kind of scary. And I'd always had an interest in children's literature, an academic interest in children's literature, and I was doing my undergraduate degree in English and film. So I was studying children's literature on the English side, and I was doing a horror genre module on the film studies side. But for some reason, it just had never really occurred to me that there was a crossover between these two things, and that actually a lot of the texts that I had enjoyed growing up could be classified as children's horror. But then I did have a lecture in that horror module in my third year on children's horror, and that was delivered by Amy Davis at the University of Hull. And all of a sudden it was a bit like a light bulb moment where I realized, oh yeah, The Witches is a children's horror film, Coraline was a children's horror film, Gremlins, and all these other things that I had grown up watching, and Goosebumps and whatever. So I did an essay on children's horror for that module, and it became quite apparent that there was not very much scholarship on this category, despite the huge amount of scholarship both on children's literature and on the horror genre. And that seemed odd, given that there were lots of really obvious ways that these categories overlapped. If we look at fairy tales or cautionary tales, and then some of the more recent examples that I've just mentioned. So after that essay that I did in the third year of my undergraduate degree, that kind of spiraled into a master's dissertation, which became a PhD thesis, which obviously became a book. So it's been through quite a lot of different iterations right now. And in terms of motivations, it was really just to be able to say, look, this is a category, it does exist. it has a really long and important history in both children's culture, in the film industry, an important history in the history of the horror genre as well. And by looking at this, we can actually debunk many of the assumptions that tend to get made about children and horror, namely the inaccurate idea that they're incompatible and that horror might not be very good for children.
Which of course is at the heart of many, many moral panics associated with horror, isn't it? So it's most definitely something that needs to be challenged and complexified, and you've contributed enormously to that, and we'll continue to think about that later on when the panel join us as well. But I wanted to sort of home in on a particular concept, which I think is at the heart of the book, and that's your kind of conception of the horrific child, which is really kind of the unifying concept, I guess, behind much of what you're trying to achieve in the book. And it's also kind of connected to the cover star of your book, who is sitting behind you on the radiator there and is obviously on the cover as well, Gizmo, who you know the cover of the book. It's a fantastic cover, but you haven't just picked it because it's a fantastic cover and looks great. It's also because it has that kind of connection to this concept of the horrific child. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that concept and its importance to your book.
Well, it does all come down to Gremlins, really, which is a film that I knew I wanted to write about right from the beginning of my PhD, partly just because it's a film that I really, really like. And I wanted to write about it, and I wanted to make sure that whatever definition of children's horror that I came up with, that somehow I would be able to justify Gremlins as a children's horror film. And it was very easy to do that because when I was looking into the kind of production background and stuff around Gremlins, and I realized that the marketing of the film was very much at odds with some of the really violent content of the film. And I turned up things like cereal adverts and tie-ins that presented Gremlins as this really child-friendly film. And so from a very early stage, I was really interested in this film. And of course, the really important industrial and historical role that it had as a PG-rated film, but because of its violent content and the content of another film, Indiana Jones at the Temple of Doom, the PG-13 rating was then created, which, as Filipa, who's also on the panel, discusses in her own book, this is a really key turning point for the history of children's horror. So for all of those reasons, Gremlins was something I knew I wanted to write about, and it was the very first case study that I started to write when I was doing my PhD. And in doing that, I also started to realize that the Gremlins themselves were these really fantastic metaphors for the cultural anxieties about the relationship between children and horror. The Gremlins are these childish creatures which start out like Gizmo as very cute and kind of in many ways like these stereotypical, very compliant children, but then who can become really horrific and monstrous overnight if they're exposed to the quote unquote wrong things or the wrong culture. But at the same time, the Gremlins themselves make for these really fun and I think anarchic and subversive reflections of the child audience of address. So that was kind of the argument that I started to formulate around Gremlins when I was doing the PhD. Although strangely enough, the argument that I've got in the book, where I used that idea of the horrific child to approach all of children's horror, that actually was not really in the PhD, or at least it wasn't as much of a central concept. The PhD thesis was more like a kind of broad examination of the key themes of children's horror films and how children's horror balances the expectations of children's culture and horror. So as part of that, I talked about Gremlins, and I compared Gremlins with Paranorman as a way of contrasting representations of children who are in some way horrific and engage with the horrific. but it was really localized to just this one chapter in my PhD rather than being the whole point. So when it came to writing the book, Gremlins was actually one of the case studies I revised quite late, because it was the one that I felt didn't really need that much revision. And when I was doing that, I started to realize, oh, okay, this is actually just the whole book. What I'm saying about Gremlins is what I'm saying about pretty much all of children's horror. And I realized that I could make the book feel, well, I hope, feel a bit more cohesive than my thesis did. And that I could do something, I don't know, a bit more original, I guess. And also that I could make the thesis and the book just feel like very different things, which I'm glad that I ended up doing. Some people published their thesis into a book very quickly, and I'm very jealous of those people, because it was actually a really horrible experience I did not enjoy. But I think that what has turned out made it worth it. And so when it came to choosing a cover, and the publishers provided, lots of different options, but then there was the one of Gizmo looking off to the side at something horrific just beyond the frame. And I realized that had to be the one, because it really summed up that idea of the children of children's horror as horrific in all these different ways, whether that's because they are horrific in some way or because they engage with horror within the contexts of the films. And he's really cute.
And that's a good enough reason in itself, Kat, to have him on the cover, but all the other stuff is really important as well. And I have to say, really valuable insight there, in terms of that process of turning a PhD into a book, which can be a difficult process. So it's really fascinating that you actually arrived at the point where you realised that Gremlins was this kind of unifying film after a long period of time of working on this study. I'm sure a lot of people who are here tonight will identify with that process, the way that doesn't happen overnight, that you come to that kind of realisation. Before we introduce the panel, can I just check with you? Am I right that there is a a publisher discount on the book for those attending tonight? Is that right?
There is. I don't remember what the code is, but I know if people have access to the Facebook page for this SIG, I think I posted it on there. But I can try to find that at some point later, and I'll post it in the chat for people.
Great. We'll make sure that there's a reminder of that at some point.
Laura says it's discounted on the website, which is true. I think it's not as discounted as much as you would get with the code, so it's worth trying the code instead. Yeah, fantastic.
Okay, let's introduce our panel, bring them into the discussion as well. So panel, if you'd like to put your cameras on and unmute yourselves, and I will introduce you and welcome you to the discussion. So first of all, as you can see, we've got Stacey Abbott, who's a reader in film and television studies at the University of Roehampton, and no stranger to our events here. I'm happy to welcome her back. In some ways, Stacey doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give her one anyway. Her research, of course, focuses on the horror genre centrally and the Gothic in film and television, with a particular specialism in both vampires and zombies, and that's evident in your, I think, most recent book, Stacey, on Near Dark for the BFI Classic series.
Yes.
And obviously you're also someone who writes extensively on cult television as well. And am I right that your current project is actually sort of kind of related to what we're discussing tonight, because it's to do with horror and animation? Is that correct?
That is true. That is the project that I'm immersed in at the moment.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Well, welcome, Stacey. We've also got Filipa Antunes as well, who lectures at the University of East Anglia. She's already been mentioned, and her wonderful book has been mentioned as well, Children Beware, Children Horror and the PG-13 rating, which I would also heartily recommend. That traces the children's horror trend in the 80s and 90s and links it to key cultural and industrial developments in the US, including issues relating to regulation, which Kat has already mentioned with regards to a film like Gremlins. And just to give your latest article a plug, Filipa, I know you've got an article forthcoming with Alec Plowman, which explores the children's toys made for Alien in 1979 and which is forthcoming in horror studies. So connects in a way to what Kat was saying about Gremlins earlier, and the way in which, you know, marketing for Gremlins sort of cropped up in unexpected contexts. And I know that's something that you're fascinated with and you're pursuing. We also got Jay Bamber. Jay is currently studying for a PhD at Roehampton, and his interest is centered on genre, with his thesis exploring the relationship between the horror genre and the Disney Corporation. So again, as you can see, all of our panel are fascinated in different ways with that really interesting intersection between children and horror. And finally, Victoria Mullins, who is studying for a PhD at Cambridge University, with her PhD focused on the relationship between Disney's animated features and Hollywood horror films. So welcome to you all. And the first thing I wanted to ask is kind of building on some of the things Kat and I were discussing there. I know it's a question that fascinates me, which is, you know, and Kat acknowledges it right at the beginning of the book, this notion, and it's a prevalent one, that horror and children are fundamentally incompatible as ideas and notions and research topics. And I wondered what all of your views were on that. You know, what for you do you think are the main factors that feed into that long-held conception that they're incompatible? Kat, could we start with you?
Sure. So I think on the one hand, you have the cultural construction of children as stereotypically that childhood is this time of innocence, naivety, and that children themselves are kind of passive beings who need the protection of adults and the guidance of adults. So in many ways, that idea of innocence and naivety conflicts with the dominant ideas that we have of the horror genre, which is thought of as being the domain of adults only, really. And I think that we can see this playing out as well in what I call adult horror films, where the representation of children and in adult horror tends to be quite limited, with some exceptions, but quite limited, as being through this adult gaze where children tend to be either victims who need to be saved or villains who need to be destroyed. And I think it really reinforces that idea that when children and the horror genre come into contact, bad things are going to happen, either to the child or to the people as a result of the child being this, you know, a demonic monster or something like that.
Stacey, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree with Kat?
I absolutely agree with Kat. The thing I would add as well is that I think that often when people come at this question about compatibility, it's often because the people in question who have very strict ideas tend to apply a limited or a very strict definition of what we mean by horror to that conception. So, you know, when people talk about horror and children, some people will go to graphic body horror or slasher films or various things, and I think it's a limited perspective on the genre and doesn't acknowledge actually horror can mean many things, and horror doesn't have to be strictly defined by what I call the scare factor. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be it's terrifying. It can be unsettling, disturbing, you know, challenging in these ways. And I think that that's one of the reasons why people think it's incompatible, because they're applying adult conceptions of horror to film, to the genre, and not recognizing that horror is very different when it is made for and aimed at children. And the other thing that I would say, I find it ironic that there is this kind of perception, because I often think that in cursory looks at when people talk about where they develop their interest in horror, you know, most people who talk about having an interest in horror talk about having gained it as children, you know, watching on TV. And I think so there's a kind of incompatibility in a lot of people's thinking by sort of recognizing, well, we were all watching it as kids or attracted to it, but somehow it's still not appropriate. So I think there's a kind of curious tension there.
Filipa, sort of bringing you into this, because in a way, you know, you've researched kind of regulation and thinking about, you know, debates around horror and children from that perspective. What are your thoughts on this kind of really, really central idea here, really, that horror and children incompatible? What factors do you think have fed into that?
Well, I definitely agree with what Kat and Stacey have said. And what I would add to that is that we seem to have developed a tradition, I think, both in fandom and in a way in scholarship as well, of starting from the perspective of having to defend the genre in a way, because it's been so often attacked precisely for being childish. It's for children. And I think what Stacey was saying just now, we are maybe most of us drawn to horror as children. So there's almost a push to defend, well, why isn't it like fairy tales? Why isn't it kids stuff? So I think in defending it against that attack, we often maybe push a bit too hard on the question that it isn't for children. And, to come back to this point about regulation as well that you mentioned there, the fact that we have established horror as being primarily an R-rated genre. Yeah. And in fact, there's all of this discussion around PG-13 horror being, a sellout or too commercialized, not really horror. There's this question of legitimacy in a way. So horror that is real horror, legitimate horror, is R-rated, is for adults, and everything else just doesn't really count. And it's ironic, as Stacey said, because it's just incompatible with a lot of our memories, really. So it's a complicated thing. But what I would add there as well is that this tradition seems to continue in scholarship as well. So we just haven't looked at horror and children together. So there's no established tradition of doing those things together, even when we recognize, as Stacey said, that actually there are examples where they do go together.
And I'll come back to that question of regulation, because I've got a few other things I wanted to raise on that, but I just wanted to bring Jay in as well. Jay, what's your take on this in terms of the incompatibility of children and horror, and why that's been such a sort of long-running conception within culture more broadly?
I sort of have two thoughts. One is that I think it's largely ahistorical. I have always been fascinated with the monster kid movement. As soon as the Universal monster movies were introduced onto television in the shop packages, children took to them very quickly and had a real emotional connection with them. I think sometimes people who disagree with us would put us in the position of saying this is a new phenomenon. There are stories, apocryphal or not, of children sneaking in to see Dracula in the early 30s. So I think this is, when people sort of go against us, I feel like saying, well, as long as there has been cinematic horror, children have tried to gain access to it. And the other take I would have is I think it's an unusually self-reflective genre. Often in things like Monster Squad, I don't expect anybody to have watched them, but in almost every Disney Channel original horror movie, it is focused on children who love horror.
Yeah.
And
so I think it's a genre that is quite invested in the idea that it's made for the fans who will be watching it anyway.
Mm-hmm. And that's the point Kat makes in the book, doesn't she, in regards to Monster Squad, but some of the other examples she looks at as well, that many of the narratives are focused on this idea that the children at the centre of the story are knowledgeable about the genre, and that's something that's just an everyday part of their lives. So it's that acknowledgement is even there in some of the children's horror films that are targeted specifically at children in that way. I wanted to come back to the issue of regulation and to bring Filipa back in about that, if that's all right, because obviously we've already started to think about the role censorship has played in kind of reinforcing or challenging that idea that horror and children are incompatible. And Jay's just mentioned this idea that that's a very ahistorical notion. But one of the other things that fascinates me is the fact that, the way in which, say, a film like Alien, so Filipa, I thought this would be something that would interest you in particular, the way that the certificate for Alien has kind of gone down over the years, or, there have been kind of debates in the BBSC over the years about, how adult something like Alien might be, how adult something like Jaws might be, to what extent reducing the certificate for films like that actually brings in audiences who want to engage with horror. And in that way, you know, censors have quite an, I mean, clearly people can watch these films illicitly, as Stacey just indicated, you know, watch them underage, but also that on both sides of the Atlantic, in the US and the UK, what certificate the censors give these films can have an enormous impact on how they're categorised. What's your view on that, Filipa? And the important role played by regulation here?
So as you said, you know, as Jay was saying, I think you need to look at these things historically. So censorship and regulation are not static things. So they also change along with the period and along with different conceptions of horror. So Jaws is a really great example where it was rated PG, and there were actually no debates around that. It was just accepted that film is perfectly suitable for a mainstream, you know, child audience. And yet now perhaps we look at it as being a bit weird that that film was rated PG. And I think with horror, especially in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, when the R rating comes in, when the ratings come in to replace overt censorship as we had with the production code, there's again that sense of horror becoming attached to a particular genre, to the restricted area of films, to something that's a little bit transgressive. So I think when we look back, we maybe impose that view that we have now of horror being a bit transgressive and, you know, being not for a mainstream audience, when actually Universal monsters, as Jay said, have always been child favorites. Jaw and Alien, which initially I think was not meant to be rated R and had children's toys. So there's an interesting tension there when we look at regulation that is fascinating.
Stacey, I don't know if you've got anything to add on this.
Well, I suppose the only thing I would add is, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, and what I would add is that sense that censors play a curious role, because on the one hand, you know, as films age and conceptions of horror change, those ratings do shift, because what kids in particular are exposed to, what everyone's exposed to, does shift. So it becomes more palatable. It becomes just, you know, the bar changes what they're setting. So those ratings shift and are naturally going to change. But yet at the same time, you know, when you sort of look back and think of the role that they had, you know, very early on, you think of in the UK, you know, the H certificate was introduced in the UK in response to horror films, you know, and this kind of concern over children, those children that Jay describes trying to sneak into Dracula, you know. So there's a kind of curious thing about, on the one hand, recognizing that the standards are changing, on the other hand, this kind of sense of kind of anxiety over the impact of horror, whether that's, you know, in cinemas with the kind of ratings, and you mentioned earlier moral panics, that I'm sure we'll come back to, kind of the moral panics that hit over this anxiety over what happens if kids see this material. But that's been happening since the earliest days of horror, where these films have been perceived to be terrifying, and yet 20 years later, Dracula and those films that generated the H certificate were on television. And the kind of movement of films to television, which I know raises all kinds of its own issues around censorship, etc. But it becomes, once it's on television, I think the perception is it is palatable, it is appropriate, it's safe. And, you know, and again, I won't digress into the issues and what that says about television, but I think there's a whole other series of perceptions of horror on television that makes it more perceived to be more acceptable. Like, it's okay if it's on TV, that's secure and safe. And yet I'm sure we've all sat in our bedrooms as children or somewhere watching TV terrified, like, you know, and I have very vivid memories of being at home terrified watching these horror movies, but somehow that's okay. So I think there's some really interesting kind of tension there around the role of regulation in terms of both restricting but also fostering these interests in horror.
Absolutely. And of course, yeah, the H certificate is fascinating, isn't it, in that respect? And that idea that if you think, well, a H certificate is synonymous with adults only, again, that challenges that idea that you mentioned at the beginning, Stacey, that, you know, horror is for everybody. It's not just for adults. So it was there ingrained in the censorship system, that kind of perception in a really unhelpful way. Yeah,
absolutely.
Sort of broadening things out and you know, bringing Kat's book back into the mix here. You know, it does appear, if we think about the fact that we've got Kat's book and we've got Filipa's book that have come out really in the last year or so, that we've got really a kind of growing trend within horror studies and within the study of children's culture to actually, you know, challenge this idea that horror and children are separate and they're incompatible, and that in fact that we can, you know, explore really fascinating aspects of horror as a cultural form through actually combining them in interesting ways. And why do you think that you know, we've only now started to get, I mean, we've had lots and lots of key pieces of scholarship prior to that which have explored that intersection between horror and children in interesting ways, but we've now got your two books coming out in quite quick succession. It's really exciting. So why do you think that it's now that this is happening, that this issue is starting to be looked at? Shall we start with Kat for this one? So Kat, you know, as the author of the book that we're here to celebrate the publication of, what's your view on that?
This is something I talk about in the introduction of the book, and actually it reminds me of something that Alison Pierce said in the launch in this SIG for her book Women Make Horror about a year ago. And I remember her, I don't know if she's here, but I remember her saying something to the effect of that part of the reason that women's roles in the making of horror films had largely been sidelined was partly just because a lot of the people writing those canonical works of horror scholarship were men, and they were men writing about what they had grown up with and what they knew. And a lot of the time those were things that were also kind of about and made by other men. And I think that it's a slightly similar thing with children's horror, in that people write about the things that they grew up with. And that could be stuff like the Universal monster films, which as Jay acknowledged, like those had huge child audiences and those had huge child fans, but they weren't necessarily children's horror in the same way that some of the more contemporary texts are. They weren't necessarily produced with children in mind as the primary audience. So I think, and it ties in with something that Filipa talks about in her own book as well, that the emergence of contemporary children's horror around the sort of late 70s and 1980s and 90s coincides with the childhoods of many of the people kind of on this panel, and probably in the audience as well. And so, you know, we're now coming of age as academics and writing about the things that we grew up with, which includes Gremlins and The Monster Squad and Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark, and loads of stuff like that. So I think it's just this confluence of children's horror and like sort of Gen X millennial academics kind of coming of age at the same time.
Filipa, would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yes. I think there's a big generational factor here, where we are now in a position to have the PhD, have the book, and finally write about the things of our childhood that we remember and legitimize them in a way. I think that's really important. And also what Kat said there about the academy and scholarship perhaps becoming a little bit more open to different viewpoints and to challenging these assumptions that have been the assumptions of the discipline, that actually horror and children don't go together.
Mm-hmm. Victoria, I'd really like to bring you into the discussion at this point. What's your view? Do you think that it is a kind of generational factor that's bringing this kind of scholarship to the fore? Would you agree with that?
I definitely think so. And it's so fascinating to hear everyone talk about it. I've just been sitting here like nodding my head and taking so many notes. But I think as well, something that I guess noticed within my own sort of reading around it, well, for one, what Kat really illustrates in her book is the importance of pleasure which I think speaks to the things you connect with when you're a child, and something that's been really overlooked a lot of the time when thinking about children. It's often in terms of moralizing them or what message can be imparted and whether horror is good or bad. So I think Kat's book does an amazing job of not getting into those debates and instead focusing on that aspect of pleasure, which is so central to all of the conversations around the enjoyment of horror more broadly.
Yeah, and it's something which is previously been seen as not something you can talk about in thinking about children and horror, this notion that they can gain pleasure from it. So it's so important. Stacey, what are your views? Do you think there is this kind of generational element to this scholarship that's emerging on this on children's horror?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's definitely an aspect of it. I absolutely agree there isn't a generational thing. People are writing about what they grew up with, and I absolutely agree with that. The only thing I would add to that, though, is I also think it is about ironically enough, I think it's about the maturing of horror as a discipline of study, that the development of the discipline shifts and changes as we're fighting our corner for it as an area of study. And so, we have, the initial focus is very, we have the theoretical models, the semiotics audiences, there's the discussion kind of evolves and people defining it. And as I think it was Filipa said earlier, having to defend the study of this as being serious study. But I think now we're in a position where horror studies is very well established. It's expanding as a discipline, and it's enabling people to suddenly say, well, actually, horror is a lot more than what we've said so far. And we're in a stronger grounding to sort of say horror, it doesn't have to be one thing. It can be many things, and it can serve many audiences and many pleasures. And it isn't just about one particular approach. So I think it's also about the discipline maturing and now recognizing actually it's much more complicated than we've said so far, which is why I think it's really exciting to see all this work now.
Jay.
Sorry, just to jump on that, I think as the discipline matures, we're more and more willing to acknowledge that horror might be a safe space for people, a pleasurable space for people, a comfortable space for people. And so why should that model not then be applied to children?
Yeah.
If it's a safe space for women, there's been many studies, there's much work on that, because that's a similar relationship. I always think, why would women like horror is often a similar conversation as why would children like horror. And I think as we've become more, as women, like on the panel, have done more and more work on the women's relationship to horror, I think that's opened up a space for children's academics to say, well, maybe this might be a safe space for children as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Following on from that, I wanted to, because we've talked a lot about the relationship between children and horror in terms of the academy and horror studies and so forth. But during the course of our discussion so far, we have sort of named particular films. So lots of films have come up in the discussion. I just wanted to get more of a sense from some of you. Kat talks about that really important tension in many of the films that she's looking at, which she would class as children's horror, between, I'm quoting you here directly, Kat, so I hope you don't mind, that horror films for children have to sort of walk that fine line between being not too scary, but scary enough at the same time, which I find fascinating and think is a real skill to be able to achieve that. I was just wondering, are there films that in your view manage that particularly effectively, whether they're films that Kat's looking at or from that period that she's looking at from the 80s and onwards, or from other periods? Stacey, what are your thoughts on this?
I really agree with this, and I was thinking of the number of films that come to mind, and I think one of the things I would say to this is that when we're talking about films and this balancing act, we also have to, I'm talking about films for children, remember that there's a wide spread of ages for children. And so I think there are films that do this, but they're not necessarily for all children. And one of the films I think for me really does this very well is Paranorman, which I think is a very richly, actually I find it quite terrifying film, but it walks that line, and it does exactly what Kat talks about in relation to the kind of monster child and all of the negotiating that kind of inner narrative of being the alienated child who relates more to ghosts than to people around him, but still confronts us with kind of horror. And I think invites the audience and the child audience to both be scared, but also to recognize difference, to realize that there's a narrative behind the scary. And I think that's one of the things it does really well, is that we have the zombies until the zombies start talking and you realize they have their own story, and we have the witch and she has her own story. So I think that one for me does really well, does a really good job. The other person I would give a shout out to, which we've mentioned in relation to Gremlins, but I just think the work of Joe Dante generally is someone, he's constantly negotiating this in so many of his films, from Gremlins obviously, but I would do a shout out to things like Small Soldiers and The Hole, which again I think is constantly walking a very careful line about knowing the audience he's aiming at, and hopefully and obviously learning some of the lessons from Gremlins, and pitching it to be scary but also kind of an adventure for those kind of pre-teens or teens.
I entirely agree, and I can see that people are agreeing in the chat as well. That Craig is saying genuinely my favourite director of all time. No shame there, absolutely no shame. He's a really important figure within the horror genre in terms of that kind of that balancing act that he achieves in many of his films, as Stacey said. Filipa, your views on this? What films do you think particularly manage that kind of balancing act really well?
So Joe Dante, I would agree. But my choice, if we're talking films, would actually be The Guide by T.J. Kat. I think it's just perfect in terms of getting that balance right. It knows that it's going for that preteen age range, and it's just intense enough and has really good special effects as well. So The Guide gets my vote, definitely. Coraline, I think, strikes a similar balance for more recent films.
Kat, I hope you don't mind me bringing you into this as well. I mean, obviously you've expressed a lot of this in the book itself, but if you had to pick one film or two films that you think really is really effective at maintaining that kind of balance, what would those films be?
Honestly, I think I just have to go back to Stacey's answer, which is Paranorman, which I think really just ticks all the boxes in many ways. But it's also worth acknowledging as well that it also comes back to the issue of how we're defining horror. And actually, you know, I have to kind of thank and acknowledge Filipa, who's it was a good thing that your book came out before mine, I think, because it was really nice to be able to have my own perceptions of children's horror challenged a little bit, because you talk about this way that horror is sometimes the way that we apply horror is really defined by adult notions, and I did that to a certain extent in the journal article and my thesis. So it is what do we mean when we say horror? Because it could be that we could say that for a child audience, something like Hotel Transylvania strikes that balance. It doesn't seem really scary to us as adults, but that doesn't mean that to a child it's not scary or that it can be classified as horror. And as Stacey was saying earlier, sometimes scariness is not necessarily the best way to measure what a horror film is.
Mm-hmm. And scary is subjective, isn't it, as well?
Exactly.
You know, horror is a debatable term in terms of how we define it, and so is that notion of what is scary too. And it's a historicised term, and it shifts and changes for one individual, let alone for all of us.
Yeah, actually, I'll just shout out The Witches as well. Both versions, actually. I like both the Nicholas Roeg version and the more recent Robert Zemeckis. But I think that they, especially the original one, then the use of special effects and puppetry in that film does, and Roald Dahl's works in general just do such a great job of combining the anarchic pleasures of both children's literature and horror and making the best of them.
Yeah.
Hi, can I just jump in there as well to say about Hotel Transylvania? I've actually changed my mind on that watching it recently. I absolutely agree with you, Kat, there that it's striking a different kind of balance, isn't it? And just because it is more funny, perhaps rather than scary to us as adult viewers, doesn't mean that it isn't doing really interesting things with an idea of what is horror and what are monsters for, and just kind of doing that in a way that is perfect for a young audience and a family audience as well.
Yeah.
And I think sort of we would be bereft to not acknowledge the insane cultural afterlife of Hocus Pocus.
Yeah.
It is truly has been embedded in culture in a way that a film that was unpopular, badly received, the way that film has embedded itself in our culture. I have about 4 Hocus Pocus t-shirts in my wardrobe. I went to Florida purely to see actresses play the Sanderson sisters, and people my age were beside themselves. The merchandise, the televisual afterlife of that movie has been truly, I think, almost unprecedented.
It is. I've noticed that online on social media as well, the way that in which the status of that film is kind of building and increasing all the time. But I wanted to actually draw on notions of animation, because obviously we've got a number of experts here on the panel, but also some of those films that you just mentioned, a number of them, Coraline, Paranorman, etc., are animated. This is another kind of preconception, this idea that animation and horror are incompatible, that, you know, I mean, Kat refers to that kind of preconception in the book, this idea that animation has been seen to sort of mitigate horrific content. And I wondered what your thoughts are on the role of animation, the role it can play in children's horror. Jay, could we start with you on this? Because obviously it's something that you're looking at in various ways through your PhD. What are your thoughts on what animation can bring to horror, and particularly children's horror?
My sense is that when we talk about animation, we always come back to this idea of plasticity. That, you know, it is a mode of representation that allows the body to do unusual, strange, sometimes disturbing things. And I think the most obvious corollary to that would be the horror genre. And I think animation seems to me a particularly well-placed form to look at and talk about horror. And I think as long as there has been animation, the Wicked Queen's transformation is quite clearly calling on Gothic iconography in a way that is quite clearly horrific, and that perhaps would be, I hate to use words like inappropriate, but would have a very different effect on child audiences than in the animation form. If that was to happen in real life, it would look like American Werewolf in London. you know, and the animation is quite explicit about that. And so I think in ways animation are able to occupy Gothic iconography and quite horrific forms of transformation hidden under this guise of plasticity. Well, it's not actually real. It's a horrific thing that's happening in front of you, but because it's I get the sense, because even we have a sense that animation is authored, that many people have contributed to the formation of the animation, it doesn't feel as real maybe to people, would be my take, I think.
Victoria, what's your view? Because obviously you're also doing a PhD which has animation at its heart. Do you agree with Jay on that? Is there anything you want to add to those comments?
I do, and I love this chapter in Kat's book. It made me so happy. I revisited Coraline straight away after reading it, and then again the other night. And the issue of plasticity that Jay raises, I think, is just so fascinating, because in many ways that sort of mitigates this concept of bodily harm. But I think what's really interesting is that a lot of people, when they think about animation as being for children, they think of like Disney and the overly sentimentalized and the sort of neorealistic type of animation they do, which sort of binds a lot of the protagonists to a specific fixed form, which I think actually can reintroduce that aspect of bodily harm through the removal of the plasticity. And I think a good example of that would be Pinocchio in the transformation scene. I think it's been called like Cronenbergian, which is interesting because it predates Cronenberg by about 40 years. But then if we're thinking about sort of live action versus animation, a little while ago, there was a question posed on Twitter of if you could get your favorite horror director to remake a Disney film, what film would it be and what director? And Eli Roth responded to that saying, I've already done it. I remade Pinocchio and it's called Hostel. And if you watch those films in that lens, it's so true.
And I think it's really interesting, Victoria, to think about who gets to transform. You know, the good people are attached to nature, they're friends with animals, they're in the woods, and the bad people become dragons or snakes. Or it's interesting how horror animation, just through the lens that we particularly look at, seems to curry favor that the bad people get the horrific transformation and the good people get to restore sort of the pastoral ideal.
This is the really interesting thing with The Princess and the Frog, is that it like deliberately engages with that sort of concept of the pastoral and the idea of the animal helper. Obviously there are so many, it's so problematic what they did with that film, but I guess that's just a really interesting aspect of it, how that sort of switches that mode and makes the central protagonist the one that transforms.
Stacey, obviously this is something that you're looking at the moment as well, the relationship between animation and horror.
Yeah.
Do you agree with Jay and
I do. I mean, I think that I agree with all of that. And I think it's all of those factors have contributed to how particularly censors and media have responded to this kind of horror by saying, well, it's animation, it's okay. That surprised that got through, but it's animation, so it's okay. But one of the things I would argue, though, alongside this is that animation is also inherently uncanny. And there is something in its form. Well, on the one hand, it does have this materiality, allows us to say we know it's constructed. There's also something about it is the inanimate made animate. There's something inherently uncanny, and those transformations are also, there's something about the fluidity of an animation that is uncanny. And I think I go back to the point about how we define horror. And I think there's something about animation that really lends itself to horror in really important ways, that it's not, you know, that we're not just defining it by the scare factor, but by that kind of creep factor. It's creepy. And I think, Kat, you talk about the use of the word creepy a lot in relation to a lot of these films, and as a kind of way of thinking about kind of the uncanny. And I think there is something about that. And I think we shouldn't, you know, again, it comes back to there's something that animation's doing something different with horror through its very texture, which I think a lot of these films play up on. It's particularly the case with stop motion, but I would say it's also with other types of animation, although stop motion does it really well. Coraline even more so, because it was stop motion in 3D. Like, so there was something wonderfully uncanny about that.
Kat, any thoughts to add to that idea, particularly in relation to something like Coraline, which you obviously write about at length in the book?
Yeah, I think it's something like Coraline, but also Watership Down, the poster for which I've got behind me, both reveal how the assumption that animation somehow mitigates horror or makes it child friendly, how ridiculous that is as a claim. So, and this is where censorship comes back in as well, because Watership Down was given a U rating, despite the fact that it was never intended to be a film for children, and it was not marketed as a film for children, but it was animated and it was given a U rating by the BBFC because it's animated, and that made everyone think that it was a children's film. And that's how you end up with people born in the 70s and 80s being really traumatized by Watership Down.
Yeah. Me, I'm one of those.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely.
But on the other hand, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I mean, it was definitely, like, anyone who was severely traumatized by Watership Down, I'm very sorry, and that probably shouldn't have happened. But it does mean that the animation can be really subversive, and that it, because of those assumptions that it's less effective, that animated horror is less effective, it means that children can be exposed to things a bit creepier or a bit more subversive and horrific, because the BBFC and the MPAA think, oh, it's just a cartoon, so it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, those sort of, you know, ingrained cultural connotations that people have when they think about animation. It's true that they need to be challenged in lots of ways and interrogated, definitely. I just wondered, you know, we've talked there about this issue of categorization has come up repeatedly in different ways. And you know, Filipa and Kat, you both talk about in your work, respectively, about whether there might be a growing awareness of kind of, if not children, at least younger audience sectors that certain kinds of horror films are being aimed at, you know, whether that's becoming, you know, for instance, millennial pre-teens, which I know is something you write about, Filipa, quite a lot in your work, this idea that we're now getting more targeted horror media that are aimed specifically at those age groups that marketers kind of recognise as distinct audience sectors. What are your views on that, Filipa?
Yeah, I think this question really is key, because what makes children's horror work is precisely that idea that it is targeted to that audience. So we as adults might not find it scary or legitimate as horror, but maybe the children that it's aimed at do. So that notion that there are particular demographics that these texts, these films are aiming at is really important. Which is why in the 80s and the 90s, you really see this boom of children's horror texts, especially in those media like TV and popular fiction, where there is an established market for texts aimed at that specific audience, as opposed to in Hollywood, where a film, even a PG or PG-13 rated film, needs by definition to cater to a wider market. So it becomes a bit trickier to hit that balance. I think you see this in an interesting way now, where Hollywood really is condensing everything into that PG-13 category, and it is aiming at a very broad international global audience. It's maybe harder to target it as effectively. But in contrast, you look at Netflix and other streaming platforms, especially, where you can narrowcast it that way. You can select, okay, I'm just going to aim at this niche audience. And that's where we're seeing now children's horror really grow, where industrially and economically it becomes viable to make something that can just target the preteen or the younger teen.
Stacey, if you've got thoughts on that as well.
Well, I think I agree with what Filipa was saying, but what I would add is that I think that the media generally is diversified exponentially in the landscape we're in at the moment, and I'm thinking particularly if you think of television, you know, there's so many different spaces and places filling their screens with material, whether it's streaming services or channels or cinemas. And I think so that sense, I think all media is becoming much more diversified in targeting. And I think when you have a media landscape that is now fantastically competitive because they're trying to draw people to their channels, to their providers, horror is really effective. You know, horror fans of all ages are very loyal, and I think we're seeing that now across all ages. So that's why we're seeing so much horror in so many spaces aimed at different audiences. So because there's a recognition that those fans will come to start there, look for that. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think we're seeing so much is it's competitive, and we're a loyal fan, and they're recognizing that in all ages, that there are kids who are really interested in it, and there always have been, so beginning to cater for that in ways that just bring people to their channels.
I think also, just to jump on that, there's been quite a lot of work that actually parents are rather lax about what children watch in the home. There's quite, like at the beginning of my PhD, I quote quite a few studies where parents self-identify as being strict and then judged against what the children have seen, or I suppose at least say they've seen. Actually, the domestic space is one where parents garner little control, maybe, or little understanding of what their children are watching.
Yeah. But I would add to that also that we have generations of people growing up on horror material who are also watching these things with their kids and encouraging this in children, you know, managing it, but also, you know, sharing, passing on this. So there's also, again, going back to that generational point, that I think we're just fostering new generations, and the media industry recognize that.
I wanted to...
Sorry, Kate, just to jump in there, there's an
course,
interesting between what you were just saying, Stacey, about fostering that new generation of horror fans, and what Jay said earlier, and Kat makes this point as well, about the horror fan who is a child often being the protagonist of these, especially newer children's horror. So there's an acknowledgement that there might be a knowing audience there as well.
Absolutely.
I wondered, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground in the space of the last hour, which shows, I think, in and of itself, that this is a really vibrant, exciting, rich area of discussion within horror studies. But where, you know, obviously Kat and Filipa's books have come out and have really offered these kind of original, thought-provoking perspectives on this whole area of children and horror. Where do you think the field is going to go next, Kat? You know, in terms of what are the questions that you think now we've established that we have this field and that we have a lot to discuss in relation to it. What do you think are the kind of the burning questions that researchers interested in this kind of relationship between children and horror now need to be asking?
Well, I think I can start answering that by talking about how many gaps there still are in the study of children's horror. So mine and Filipa's books, we both mainly look at film and exclusively at the US context. So it's amazing that we've got people like Jay and like Victoria who are expanding that ever so slightly by looking, for example, at the Disney Channel original movie on television, or looking at, in Victoria's case, in applying kind of horror theory to Disney animated films that we might not even necessarily have categorized as horror, like the Disney fairy tales and things like that. But there's so much more to explore. You know, you mentioned Filipa's work on the Alien toys, and there's so much more to explore in relation to toys, video games, even you know, comic books and stuff in relation to children and horror. How does children's horror look different when it's in these different media? What about outside of the US? You know, I know that there is a little bit of work on British children's horror television, for example, like Helen Wheatley's excellent article on that, or, you know, something like Watership Down. But there's, you know, outside of the UK and the US, what does children's horror look like when it's in different cultures? So there's all of that. I think there's also a lot more to be said about identity and diversity in children's horror. As a genre, it still tends to be, sadly, very, very white, very, very male. And so there's more to be said about the lack of diversity, but also examining some of the few representations that there are of, for example, children of colour, or applying kind of queer approaches and that kind of thing. And outside of that as well, so I want to see just, you know, lots more stuff on children's horror. But what I also think it would be really nice to see, and this is like my plea to everyone listening today, is that it would just be really, really nice to see children's horror acknowledged and included in studies of the horror genre more broadly, you know. So I want projects on children's horror, and by the way, I am definitely available as a PhD supervisor if there's any future PhD students in the audience who want to come and study with me. But it would also, you know, include children's horror in like your horror syllabuses if you teach a module on horror. Include it in your surveys of the genre if you're writing on, you know, women in horror. Have you thought about children's films? If you're writing on, you know, zombie films or ghost films, have you thought about paranorman or whatever? So That's it. That's my plea, is don't forget that children's horror exists. It is real horror, and it deserves to be acknowledged as well.
I think that's, I'm really glad that you've been able to sort of make that plea in the context of this event. I think that's really important, Kat. Thank you. We've got a wide range of questions coming in. Do continue to post questions into the chat, which either you can ask yourself or I can ask on your behalf, but we've had a number kind of coming in during the course of the discussion. So the first one is for you, Kat, and it's from Adam Wybray. Hi Adam. And it kind of builds on some of the things you were just mentioning, actually. He asked, do you think your definition of children's horror can be productively mapped onto video games and also outside of film to game adaptations such as the Gremlins and Coraline games? What's your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I didn't know, is this a Coraline video game maybe? Because if so, I didn't know that there was one. But I haven't personally really thought that much about whether the definition I propose could be mapped onto video games, and there might be some differences in how horror is kind of structured and represented in video games than in film. But someone should do that. Try it. See what happens. I think that absolutely it could be.
Yeah, Adam is saying yes, indeed. And he's also put a link to the Coraline video game as well there in the chat too. A question from Kay Saberton. Hi, Kay. This is for everyone on the panel, and I guess this is coming off what you were saying much earlier in the discussion, Kat, about your experience of undertaking a PhD in this area and then moving or adapting that into a book. And Kay is saying, as many of the panel have or are undertaking PhDs, she wonders if the panel has any general advice for someone considering embarking on a PhD focused on children's horror or children's gothic. Stacey.
Email me.
Okay.
That's my advice. Email me and we'll talk about it. But
Good answer, Kat.
Stacey, any advice from you?
Well, I was going to say email Kat. I think you should do it. I think it's a rich topic, and I think one of the things about it is that it's, as we've illustrated, there's a huge amount that we covered, and it is rich and fertile terrain. You know, there's a lot you can draw upon, and you've got key works like Filipa's and Kat's work that I think are really useful to have now, that there are these really key texts, but they just set up all the questions to answer. So my advice would be, you know, to be looking at those works, thinking about those questions of gap, and thinking about, you know, where the most productive gaps are. I mean, I would highlight things like diversity and the global range of this, because I feel like that's really untapped, and I think would be very interesting for universities now. I think it would fit really well in with kind of where horror studies is shifting and moving. So those would be my recommendations, is to think through, you know, those questions as you start to plan the PhD.
Okay, my advice would be email Kat. And don't, I sometimes find myself falling into the trap where I'm on the back foot. Sometimes I start every chapter with, I know this seems unusual, or I know this doesn't seem an obvious fit, or I know I'm drawing on work that isn't necessarily related to film. And it's a trap, and it doesn't work, and it sets you up for failure. So if you are applying for a PhD in the area, go in knowing there's a lot of work and there's a lot of space for you to do so, and that you don't always have to keep defending your position.
And presumably in relation to that, Jay, that it's also potentially an enormously interdisciplinary field, because you know there have been people who are working on the intersection between children and horror outside of the field of film and television studies and media studies, and that there's all these interesting perspectives that you can bring in from those kind of adjacent and cognate fields into.
Absolutely. Just don't feel that you have to keep, I feel in my writing I over egg the pudding too much sometimes, and you don't have to.
That's definitely good advice for all anyone doing a PhD or anyone writing a book. I think, you know, that's definitely very useful kind of rule of thumb. Filipa, can I bring you in here? Have you got any particular advice?
My advice there would be definitely do it. We want and need your insights. And I guess beyond everything that has already been said, I would say take risks and be bold in your approach to it. You know, it is an emerging topic, so there's definitely a lot there.
And Victoria?
Definitely do it and email Kat, I would say. And also don't be afraid to disagree with established critics like Kim Newman, who
or
I
me.
know yeah, who have great points that you could just argue with them because they're so wrong in terms of dismissing children as an audience for horror and all of these things. There's such a wealth of stuff that you can engage with. It's really exciting.
Fantastic, thank you everyone. Tom Watson's got a question here. Hi Tom, and I think I saw you had a cold when you put this in the chat, so sorry to hear that and hope you feel better soon. Tom is asking, this is picking up on some of the things that we've already mentioned in different contexts during the panel. He's saying, is there a sense of an emerging transitional phase or space between children's horror and adult horror that is growing in visibility and popularity? So this is kind of building on some of the things I think Stacey was saying a little earlier. Tom says, I'm thinking of the Fear Street films, adapting the young adult horror of R.L. Stine, but arguably existing as quite intense adult horror in many respects, but also at the same time piggybacking on the popularity of things like Stranger Things, with Sadie Sink taking the lead in the second film. Throwing that open to anyone who's interested in responding to that. Anybody got a take on that?
I'll jump in because I was thinking, as we were talking, I was thinking about the Fear Street films as well. They kept coming to mind, and I think there is something. I don't think I have the answer. But I think there is something about these kind of teen-centered films that do seem to be this transitional. And I think slasher, you know, there are varying realms of slasher, but I think those are really playing with this idea of this transition between teen and adults. Because again, you know, whether we should have been or not, you know, I think many of us were watching these like slasher films in those teen years, and arguably we may or may not should have, but you know, I think that's part of, there's a coming of age process that those stories are about, and that often part of watching them is that kind of coming of age. So, you know, there is something about those. And I was struck in your book, Kat, of talking about I've forgotten the name of the Disney film that they've kind of denied that as a slasher film.
The Watcher in the Woods.
The Watcher in the Woods, yes. Again, one of these films is kind of doing a lot of that work. So I would argue that there's something to be said for the slasher and those kind of teen-centered narratives as being a transition point, albeit some may be more adult than others. But, you know, that there is something about that period for me that does seem to segue into more adult fare. And it's definitely something I know that younger, like those preteens, you're kind of aspiring to that, you know, so the Stranger Things is helping people aspire to moving up. Like, I think there is something about certain texts inviting you to want to move to the next layer of horror.
And I think there's a sort of interdisciplinary point there, because I know there's been a lot of work on, I think child readers tend to read about protagonists 5 years older than them.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's a kind of interesting reflection there in what their viewing practices as well.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I haven't seen the Fear Street films yet, but there's an interesting comparison to be made there with the Fear Street books in relation to what Stacey was saying and what the question was saying about them being a transition. When you compare Fear Street to Goosebumps, where Goosebumps is for the younger kids, and then Fear Street is a step above that, but still a step below Stephen King. So there's that, you know, just that in-between space that they come in and fill. Perhaps the films are doing the same.
Yeah.
Victoria, have you got anything to add to that?
I was just thinking of that great quote in Filipa's book about R.L. Stein being a training bra for Stephen King.
Yeah.
That made me laugh when I read that. But also I was watching an interview recently, to bring Eli Roth up again, because I know the house with the clock on its walls has been a point of contention in terms of the rating that it received, but within that he described it as a training ground to an entry point for children interested in horror. And I just thought that was an interesting connection between the two in terms of transition and the sense of training.
I love that analogy. That's great.
Yeah.
The training bar, definitely. We've got two questions here that pick up on our earlier discussion, where we were talking, when I was asking you about children's horror films that really effectively manage that balance between being scary but not too scary. The first question from Sergio, hi Sergio, is asking that he's saying he'd be really interested to know if you think, because I was actually asking you to think about exemplary exemplary cases where that's done really well, that balance. But does anyone on the panel have any examples of ones that get it wrong spectacularly, where they don't manage that balance very well between, being scary but not too scary? Any thoughts?
They're all right.
I just pointed to the Watership Down poster behind me again, because that is one, even though, as I said, it wasn't ever actually intended to be for children, but it was still received as a children's film. And then as a result of that, had this huge, I think someone needs to mute themselves.
Yeah,
just to say.
Yeah, they've done it now. Sorry, sorry, carry on.
So Watership Down, definitely, I think, even though it was not intended, it's a film that was received as, and still received as, something that got that balance wrong. Or at least in terms of the perceptions, it didn't meet the perceptions of what a children's film should look like. Children's films should not apparently have rabbits being torn to bits. I don't know, I would probably disagree. But and then maybe it's also important to point out that a lot of the films that we've already mentioned, I think, were kind of perceived as not striking that balance properly, at least when they were first received. So we've talked about Gremlins, which definitely is one of the more contentious ones, where those two sides are really pulling at each other. And as Filipa talks about in your chapter on Gremlins, the way that the sort of the Dante authorship and the Spielberg authorship were kind of presented as being at odds with one another. Or even something like ones where the balance is seen to go too far toward the childish side of it, like the Hotel Transylvania films we've been talking about as well. So I think it's all a matter of kind of perspective and how they were received when they first came out versus how they're received now, and etc.
And actually, just to bring in another question, which is sort of related to Sergio's, it's from Neil. Hi, Neil Jackson. And he was saying, following on from our discussion, he says, are there any representations of childhood in horror that panel members actually find genuinely troubling, disturbing, and potentially problematic? And not necessarily from mainstreamed palatable examples, which we've talked about a lot in the discussion. He says he speaks here as somebody who still adheres to the genre's occasional duty to confront and perhaps even offend. And any examples that you can think of representations of childhood in horror that have, for you, perhaps crossed the line or been disturbing, but maybe disturbing in a potentially interesting way?
I think for me, something that I talk about, especially in the later chapters of the book, is troubling representations in terms of stuff like gender, especially. So I try not to, I'm very much of the mind that we should stop worrying a bit so much about children being exposed to horror and then it's going to corrupt them and blah, blah, blah. But we should still keep an eye on what some of the films are representing when it comes to aspects like gender and identity and race and sexuality. So for example, a film like Monster House, a film I like a lot, but I take to task for what I see as quite a troubling representation there in terms of its female villain, and which we also see in films like The Witches and Hocus Pocus, where despite the kind of feminist, I think, subversive pleasures that can be gotten out of some of those representations of witches just kind of doing whatever the hell they want, they're still drawing on quite problematic representations, such as the monstrous feminine and things, where women who are too powerful are represented as just evil. So that's something that I think is still a bit problematic about some children's horror films.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts from anyone else about either, you know, in regards to either of those questions, either films that get that balance between scary but not too scary wrong, or that potentially border on having representations within them that are a little bit troubling or problematic?
I think in terms of the films that get it wrong, the quintessential example for me is The Watcher in the Woods. That really is just a baffling film in many ways, and no wonder when you read about the production story and everything that was going around, should it be scary, should it be Disney? They wanted it to be their Exorcist. So, you know, it's a film that's very conflicted, and when you watch it, you see it. So it's the wild variations of tone. So I would say that one gets it wrong, but in a really interesting way. As for problematic representations, I don't know. I would second Kat's answer there. There's some representations that I personally find disturbing, but that's more to do with my own sensibility than necessarily the film's crossing a line. I don't know if I would use that term, crossing a line there.
I'd say something that got it wrong commercially, I don't know about creatively, I don't want to make a value judgment, was The Black Cauldron, which was a film that was so heavily publicized, was so expensive, was so built, was sort of aimed to build a new era of the Disney franchises, and was received so poorly, largely because of the horror elements embedded in it. You know, the reports seem to suggest that children simply could not deal with The Black Cauldron. And it is a very intense, strange, oddly pitched experience, but that's one that comes to mind where audiences said the horror in this is incompatible with what we want to view from the company.
Yeah, it's funny, that's exactly the one I was going to highlight as a film, which I find fascinating as a film. The animation is disturbing and unsettling, which works for me. You know, I really enjoy it for that, and I find it a fascinating failure. And it's really interesting to see that. And so that's definitely one I think is trying to do something and just is getting their market wrong. Like I said, I have mixed feelings about the film, and part of me really likes it, but I know I'm not the target audience. But going back to Neil's question and taking a slightly different direction about films that are troubling. I mean, there's all kinds of films not aimed at kids with children, which are very troubling. I mean, I find children in horror films often the most disturbing thing, which says so much about me. But I was sort of taking back to my childhood and things I was watching with children that I think were unsettling in really good ways, but unsettling. And I go back to the Stephen King, and I have very clear memories of watching Salem's Lot on television in my bedroom, and the sequence with the kind of vampire children scratching at the windows to come and kind of vampirize their sibling or their best friend, to me, I found really amazing and really unsettling in the kind of best possible way. And I think there are those texts that, and particularly around television, which are kind of blurred about whether they're for kids, but they're not for kids, or a lot of the Stephen King, even the recent films, like where they're blurring lines of their audience, but where there is something about these children under threat and their response, and seeing the children as both monster and savior, that I think is really interesting. So I think there are these texts that, you know, again, maybe blur lines of who they're aimed at, but do really interesting things, and I think are really interesting for children. Like I have very vivid memories of Salem's Lot, and very positive memories of that experience, and really loving that thrill of the domestic, and and feeling like he's scratching at my TV screen, trying to come in. So I think there's some really interesting stuff in text that maybe may or may not be for kids, but have a child audience.
I've heard a number of people saying that, Stacey, of having that experience with that particular TV series and film. And those particular moments of it with the scratching. I think it's something a whole generation, or certainly a lot of people of that generation really remember. Victoria, and any thoughts from you to add to the discussion?
Well, thinking of a film that uses horror references in this specific sequence, and the depiction of childhood that comes out of that, I think of Toy Story, the first one, when they have the sort of horrific child Sid. A lot of the animators have said the stuff that Sid does has come from their own childhood, and it's actually Andy who's kind of weird, because he's like the good one and plays with his toys in the, I guess, marketed way. But I just always think that's interesting, because a lot of people view Sid as really horrific. And I know The Simpsons, they did a Treehouse of Horror episode recently where I think the first section of that was Bart as Sid, which was interesting, and I would recommend it.
It's funny because there's just a comment in the chat from Tom Watson saying that he says Toy Story 3 is probably the most effective horrific experience of a children's film I've had. When the toys just accept their fate towards the end of the movie, I was inconsolable for at least 30 minutes. And I'm the same. All of the Toy Story films have that kind of traumatic dimension to them, don't they? But you're right, it's very focused on Sid in the first one. We've got 2 questions left, which I'm going to try and squeeze in before the end, if that's all right with everybody. Firstly, from Craig Mann, and this actually follows on from something Kat mentioned a little while ago, the role of Steven Spielberg. So he's saying he wonders how much of the development of children's horror in the 1980s the panel credits to Spielberg. He says, I think the thing that comes to mind is the John Sayles script Night Skies, which was written as a pretty straight adult horror film, but ultimately was sort of divided 3 ways into E.T., Poltergeist and Gremlins. What do people think about his role, Spielberg, in terms of the development of children's horror from that period?
I think he does play a really significant role in it, partly because, I mean, going back to something like Jaws, which was rated a PG, I think, so lots of children would have been to see that, and it was one of the first, if not the first, contemporary blockbuster, right? So really kind of opened that space for films to be, for scary films to be marketed towards family and child audiences. And then with stuff like Poltergeist, of course, Gremlins, and his name was a big feature in the marketing for Gremlins, which may, because of his association with something like E.T. and other sort of children's fare, may have contributed to the perceptions of that as a very child-friendly film. And then a bit later on, you have stuff like Jurassic Park. And I can't recall what was the last sort of child-friendly thing he might have done, like Ready Player One. No, I don't think. Yeah, probably not. But he's definitely, got key films which, whether or not they're always part of the horror genre or whether or not he directed them, he does seem to be kind of a consistent presence, and especially in the early development of children's horror in the US.
And just final question, I just want to squeeze it in from Simon Brown. Hi, Simon. He's saying, I wonder what the panel think about the value of opening the debate beyond the horror label. Of course, we've talked a lot about the problems of defining horror, but Simon's saying Doctor Who's been scaring kids for almost 60 years, and Disney's The Black Hole in 1979, although science fiction has some very troubling content and was traumatizing for me as a child. He wondered if the panel have any thoughts about material beyond the horror genre and how that might add to the discussion. Any thoughts from anyone? Stacey, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I suppose one of the things, I agree, I think it's a really valid point. And I think one of the things I would highlight is that in a way, a lot of the texts that we've talked about that we're identifying as horror, and I think we're identifying them as horror for very particular purposes, but in many ways are inherently hybrid, you know, that are hybrid. They're child, like, you know, the Spielberg reference is these are science fiction, but they're children's adventure stories, which often feature strong elements of horror. So I think, you know, when we expand it to thinking about hybrid genres or the mixtures, what we're trying to do is think about the relationship to the horror affect within films aimed at kids, because, you know, Paranorman, which I adore, is yes, it's very subconsciously playing with horror, but it is a children's adventure, it's comedy, it's family melodrama, you know, like, and I think a lot of them are hybrid, and I think it does help. And I often, in what I'm doing with animation, I often talked about horror adjacent genres, like where I'm looking, the film may not itself be clear cut horror, but it's adjacent, it's connecting. And in Doctor Who is a great example of something that we think of overtly as science fiction, but it's clearly got such a long heritage of horror, that when we wrote the TV horror book, we talked about Doctor Who, you know, you talk about Torchwood, and, you know, so I think there are lots of these things that we need to acknowledge the hybridity of a lot of texts aimed at kids.
Kat, have you got any thoughts on that to finish up?
I think there's absolutely space to both argue with how I am defining horror and children's horror in my book, because my approach or my definition of horror is more to do with horror as a genre as opposed to an emotional response. So I think there's absolutely space to think about children's horror as maybe a feature within different genres like science fiction or fantasy or comedy. But also, as Stacey says, like, most children's films are inherently genre hybrids for whatever reason. So yeah, that's take it further. Yeah, take children's horror and just kind of play with it and do whatever you want with it, redefine it.
There's certainly a lot to do, I think, in this field, and I, you know, thank you, Kat, for sort of pioneering this work, and to Filipa too as well. I think it's testament to how rich an area this is that we could easily carry on talking for a lot longer, but we probably will have to stop there because we've gone over time a little bit. And I just want to thank you all for a really fascinating discussion. Thanks to Stacey, to Filipa, to Jay, and to Victoria, and especially to Kat, and to congratulate you again on this wonderful book. And thank you everyone for being here, and for all of your questions and engagement. Just to know, I think Shelley has put it up in the chat that our next SIG event is our Christmas special that we always look forward to, which will be a little bit more informal. So there'll be more information about that soon. We hope that people will be able to join us for that in December with a mince pie and a drink. But yeah, thank you everyone for a great discussion, and yeah, I hope you will, if you've not already done so, engage with Kat's book, and think further in the future about the importance of children's horror to horror studies as a whole, really. So thanks everybody, thank you, and see you again soon.
Thanks everyone.